They thought he was a bully, but the truth shocked everyone. The morning fog clung to Jefferson High like a shroud, and Marcus Chen felt it seep into his bones as he stood at the school's entrance, backpack heavy on his shoulders, not from books, but from the weight of everything he was trying to leave behind. His fingers traced the scar along his knuckles, a faded reminder of who he used to be, before forcing his hands deep into his jacket pockets. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the incident that shattered his world and sent his family fleeing across 2 states, searching for a place where whispers couldn't follow. The hallways of Jefferson High buzzed with the familiar symphony of teenage chaos, locker slams, sneaker squeaks, laughter that cut through conversations like broken glass. Marcus moved through it all like a ghost, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the worn linoleum beneath his feet. Every instinct screamed at him to make himself smaller, invisible, forgettable. The irony wasn't lost on him. The boy who once commanded attention through fear now prayed to disappear entirely. His first class was AP History, 3rd row from the back, right side. He'd memorized the seating chart from the school website, planning his invisibility like a military operation. Mrs. Patterson's voice droned about the Civil War, while Marcus's mind wandered to his own personal battlefield, the one that played on repeat every time he closed his eyes. The sound of David Morrison's ribs cracking, the way the smaller boy's face had gone grey. The moment Marcus realized he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. "Mr. Chen?" "Mrs." Patterson's voice cut through his memories like a blade. 28 pairs of eyes turned toward him, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Would you care to share your thoughts on Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction?" His throat felt like sandpaper. Sorry, could you repeat the question?" The words came out smaller than he intended, and he caught a few students exchanging glances. Good. Let them think he was just another quiet kid, another face in the crowd. Better that than the truth. The bell rescued him from further attention, and Marcus gathered his things with practiced efficiency, avoiding eye contact as students filed past. But as he reached for the door, a shoulder slammed into his, hard enough to send his notebook spiraling to the floor. Papers scattered like fallen leaves, and Marcus looked up to see Tyler Brooks, 6'2" of carefully cultivated menace, the kind of predator Marcus recognized because he used to see one in the mirror. "Watch where you're going, new meat," Tyler sneered, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby students to hear, but not loud enough for Mrs. Patterson to catch. His friends flanked him like hyenas, feeding off the casual cruelty with practiced ease. "Maybe you should stick to the elementary school down the street." Marcus knelt to gather his papers, hands steady despite the familiar rage beginning to simmer in his chest. This was the moment. He could feel it crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. The old Marcus would have stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch until Tyler's smirk faltered, would have smiled that cold smile that made grown men step back, would have whispered something that would haunt Tyler's dreams for weeks. Instead, he mumbled, "Sorry," and kept collecting his scattered work, letting Tyler's laughter wash over him like acid rain. The humiliation tasted like copper pennies and broken promises, but it was better than the alternative. Better than letting the monster out of its cage. "That's what I thought," Tyler said, already losing interest as easier prey caught his attention. Marcus watched him swagger away, targeting a girl with thick glasses and paint-stained fingers who was struggling with an oversized art portfolio. The predator had found his next victim, and Marcus felt something cold and familiar unfurl in his stomach. As he sat in the bathroom stall during lunch, eating a peanut butter sandwich in solitude, Marcus pulled out his phone and stared at the last text message he'd received from his old number. It was from David Morrison's mother, sent 2 weeks after Marcus's family had packed everything into a moving truck in the dead of night. 4 words that had burned themselves into his memory. He's walking again today. Walking again. Because Marcus had put him in a wheelchair for 6 weeks. Because Marcus had been the kind of person who broke bones to prove points, who turned other people's pain into his own twisted currency of respect. The sandwich turned to ash in his mouth, and he shoved the phone back into his pocket, fingers trembling with the effort of keeping himself together. The afternoon crawled by in a haze of careful invisibility, sitting in the back, speaking only when spoken to, becoming the kind of forgettable presence he'd once fed upon. But even as he played the part of the quiet transfer student, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, like pressure behind a dam. Tyler Brooks wasn't just a bully, he was a shark who'd tasted blood in the water, and Marcus knew with sickening certainty that today's encounter was just the beginning. As the final bell rang and students poured toward freedom, Marcus lingered at his locker, waiting for the hallways to empty. He'd learned that timing was everything in the delicate art of avoiding conflict. But as he finally made his way toward the exit, he heard it, the sound that made his blood run cold. Cruel laughter echoing from the east stairwell, the kind that meant someone was suffering for entertainment. Marcus paused at the top of the stairs, looking down to see Tyler and his pack surrounding that same girl with the art portfolio. Her glasses were crooked, her face flushed with humiliation as Tyler held one of her paintings just out of reach. The artwork was beautiful, a watercolor landscape that captured light like captured dreams. And Marcus watched in growing horror as Tyler pretended to examine it with exaggerated interest. Is this supposed to be art, or did you sneeze paint onto paper? Tyler's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been on the receiving end of real pain. Maybe we should put it out of its misery. The girl, Sarah, Marcus remembered from roll call, reached desperately for her painting, but Tyler held it higher, his friends creating a circle that blocked any escape. And Marcus stood frozen at the top of those stairs, caught between two versions of himself, the monster he'd been and the ghost he was trying to become. The old Marcus whispered seductive promises in his ear. How easy it would be to walk down those stairs to let Tyler see what real predators looked like. How satisfying it would feel to watch that smirk crumble into something resembling fear. But the new Marcus, the one built from guilt and desperate hope for redemption, kept his feet planted firmly at the top of those stairs, hands clenched into fists that would never again be used as weapons. As Tyler raised the painting higher, preparing to tear it in half, Marcus closed his eyes and made a choice that would haunt him for days to come. He turned away, walking toward the exit with mechanical steps, Sarah's muffled sobs following him like accusations through the empty hallways. But even as he pushed through the school's front doors into the gray afternoon light, Marcus couldn't escape the growing certainty that his past was about to collide with his present in ways that would change everything. Mal sabia ele que tudo estava prestes a desmoronar. The Chen family's new apartment sat on the wrong side of town like a penance. 2 bedrooms, paper-thin walls, and a view of the auto salvage yard where dreams went to rust. Marcus's mother had stopped trying to make it feel like home weeks ago, leaving boxes stacked in corners like monuments to their hasty escape. His father worked double shifts at the warehouse, anything to avoid the conversations that hung in the air like smoke from a fire they couldn't extinguish. Marcus lay on his narrow bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a twisted face, accusatory eyes that followed him no matter where he turned. The memories came in waves, always when his guard was down, always when silence gave them room to breathe. He could still feel the cafeteria's fluorescent lights burning against his skin, could still hear the wet sound David Morrison's body made when it hit the concrete floor. It had started with something so small, so pathetically ordinary. David Morrison, barely 5'4", glasses held together with electrical tape, the kind of kid who apologized for breathing too loudly. He'd accidentally knocked over Marcus's chocolate milk during lunch, the brown liquid spreading across the table like spilled blood. Such a tiny thing, such an insignificant moment. But Marcus had been having a bad day, had been looking for someone to absorb the rage that lived in his chest like a caged animal. and David Morrison had volunteered himself through simple misfortune. "You're going to clean that up," Marcus had said, his voice carrying that particular quality that made conversations stop at nearby tables. Not loud. He never needed to be loud. The threat lived in the spaces between words, in the way his smile never reached his eyes. David had stammered an apology, reaching for napkins with shaking hands, but Marcus had grabbed his wrist with casual brutality. "Not with napkins, with your shirt." The cafeteria had gone quiet, that electric silence that comes before lightning strikes. Marcus had felt it then, that intoxicating rush of absolute power, the way fear made people smaller while making him feel infinite. What happened next played in his memory like a horror film he couldn't turn off. David's humiliation as he was forced to use his own shirt to mop up the spilled milk while 300 students watched. The way Marcus had smiled as he ground David's dignity into powder, feeding off the boy's tears like some emotional vampire. But it hadn't been enough. It was never enough. The monster inside Marcus had tasted blood and wanted more. The real incident had come 2 weeks later, in the school parking lot after a particularly brutal day. Marcus had been coming off a suspension, his third that semester, and the familiar rage was building in his chest like pressure behind a broken dam. He'd spotted David Morrison loading books into a beat-up Honda, moving with that careful invisibility that prey animals master. And something inside Marcus had snapped. "Hey, Morrison!" His voice had cut through the afternoon air like a blade. David had looked up with the haunted expression of someone who knew their tormentor's voice better than their own mother's lullaby. "We're not done." What followed still made Marcus's hands shake 3 months later. The way he'd cornered David between 2 cars, using his size and reputation like weapons. The escalation from cruel words to calculated violence, each blow designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate. The sound of David's ribs cracking under his fists. The moment when David's legs had given out and he'd collapsed like a broken marionette, his glasses shattered, blood pooling beneath his head on the asphalt. But it was what came after that truly destroyed Marcus's world. The silence that had followed, not the electric silence of anticipation, but the horrible quiet of something irreparably broken. The way David's eyes had rolled back, showing only white. The moment Marcus realized that his victim wasn't getting up, wasn't moving, wasn't breathing right. The paramedics, the police. The way his mother had looked at him in the hospital waiting room, not with anger, but with something far worse. The dawning recognition that she didn't know her own son. David Morrison had spent 6 weeks in a wheelchair, another month in physical therapy, and would carry the scars for the rest of his life. But the real damage had been deeper. Marcus had learned later that David suffered from panic attacks now, couldn't be in crowded spaces, had to be homeschooled because the mere thought of returning to school sent him into spiraling anxiety. Marcus hadn't just broken David's body, he'd shattered the boy's ability to exist in the world without fear. The legal consequences had been severe but manageable. Juvenile detention, community service, court-mandated therapy. But the social consequences had been nuclear. Within days, Marcus's name had become synonymous with something toxic, something that parents used to warn their children about what happened when violence went too far. Death threats had arrived in their mailbox. His father had been fired from his job at the insurance company. Nobody wanted to work alongside the monster's father. His younger sister Emma had been ostracized at her middle school, coming home in tears every day until their parents had no choice but to pull her out too. So they'd run. Packed everything they could fit into a U-Haul truck and fled across state lines like refugees from their own choices. Marcus's father had found work at a warehouse in a town where nobody knew their name, where they could pretend to be normal people fleeing nothing more dramatic than economic hardship. They'd changed their last name from Morrison to Chen, a bitter irony that Marcus tasted like poison every time he signed his fake identity. The therapy sessions had been the worst part. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, with her kind eyes and endless patience, had made Marcus confront the truth he'd been running from his entire life. He wasn't just a bully who'd gone too far. He was someone who had derived genuine pleasure from other people's pain, who had built his entire identity around being feared. The realization had broken something fundamental inside him, leaving him hollow and uncertain, like a house with all the furniture removed. "You have to understand, Marcus," Dr. Hartwell had said during their final session, her voice gentle but uncompromising, "that recognizing what you've done is only the first step. The real work begins when you decide who you want to become next." Now, lying in his narrow bed in their cramped apartment, Marcus could hear his sister Emma crying through the thin walls. Another nightmare about the kids at her old school, another night terror brought on by the chaos he'd unleashed on their family. His mother's voice drifted through the darkness, offering comfort she couldn't really provide, promises that everything would be okay when they all knew it never would be. Marcus rolled over and pulled his pillow over his head, trying to block out the sounds of the damage he'd caused. But even in the suffocating darkness, he couldn't escape the image that had burned itself into his retinas. Tyler Brooks standing over Sarah with her painting, wearing the same predatory smile that Marcus used to practice in the mirror. The recognition had been immediate and nauseating. He was watching his own past play out in real time, seeing himself reflected in Tyler's casual cruelty. And the worst part, the part that made his stomach churn with self-loathing, was the tiny voice in the back of his mind that whispered how easy it would be to reclaim his old power. How satisfying it would feel to remind Tyler Brooks what real monsters looked like. How simple it would be to let the rage out of its cage, just for a moment, just long enough to solve his problems the way he used to solve everything, with violence and fear. But then he remembered David Morrison's mother, standing in the hospital corridor with her son's blood still under her fingernails, looking at Marcus like he was something that had crawled out of a nightmare. He remembered the weight of understanding that he had become the kind of person that parents warned their children about, the kind of person who turned other people's lives into horror stories. The apartment fell quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional train whistle that cut through the night like a scream. Marcus lay awake until dawn, caught between the monster he'd been and the ghost he was trying to become. While somewhere across town, Tyler Brooks was probably sleeping peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams predators dream when they haven't yet learned that their actions have consequences. But morning would come, as it always did, and Marcus would have to face another day of careful invisibility, another day of watching cruelty unfold while keeping his own demons locked away. Another day of pretending that the sight of Tyler's predatory smile didn't make his hands itch for the familiar weight of violence, didn't make him remember what it felt like to be the one who made others disappear. Mas aquela humilhação não era o fim. Era apenas o começo de algo inimaginável. The second week at Jefferson High brought with it the suffocating routine of systematic torment that Marcus recognized like his own heartbeat. Tyler Brooks had marked his territory with the precision of an apex predator, and Sarah Chen, no relation, despite sharing his assumed surname, had become his primary target with the methodical inevitability of natural selection gone wrong. Marcus watched it unfold from the safety of his carefully constructed invisibility, each calculated cruelty hitting him like a physical blow. Tyler's approach was sophisticated, refined, the kind of psychological warfare that Marcus himself had perfected during his reign of terror at Lincoln Academy. Never anything that left visible marks, never anything that couldn't be dismissed as harmless fun by administrators who didn't want to see what was happening right in front of them. It started with Sarah's art supplies disappearing from her locker, paintbrushes vanishing one by one, her watercolor set developing mysterious cracks that rendered the colors unusable. Marcus caught Tyler slipping something into Sarah's backpack during chemistry class, And that afternoon, she was called to the principal's office for possession of cigarettes she'd never seen before. The confusion on her face as she was led away was a mirror of every victim Marcus had ever framed, every innocent person he'd manipulated into taking blame for his orchestrated chaos. During lunch, Marcus sat 3 tables away, forcing himself to eat, while Tyler performed his daily ritual of psychological destruction. Today's entertainment involved Tyler's girlfriend, Madison Pierce, a calculating blonde who wielded social media like a scalpel. She'd taken photos of Sarah eating alone, adding captions that spread through the school's social networks like digital poison. Lunch with imaginary friends again, and when your art is as lonely as you are. The likes and comments poured in with the enthusiasm of a digital mob, each notification another nail in Sarah's social coffin. Marcus watched her check her phone between bites of her sandwich, watched the color drain from her face as she realized her humiliation was being broadcast to hundreds of her peers. The way her hands started shaking as she tried to delete the tags was hauntingly familiar. Marcus had orchestrated this exact scenario countless times, had perfected the art of turning technology into a weapon of mass social destruction. But Tyler's masterpiece came during 4th period biology, when Mrs. Henderson assigned lab partners for the semester's major project. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he watched Tyler volunteer to work with Sarah, his smile carrying all the warmth of a shark circling wounded prey. Sarah had looked genuinely grateful, her first sign of social acceptance since the harassment began, and Marcus had to bite down on his tongue until he tasted blood to keep from screaming a warning. The partnership was a trap, of course. Marcus had used the same technique on Daniel Morrison and dozens of others: offer collaboration, build false trust, then use that intimate access to inflict maximum damage. Over the next few days, Marcus watched Tyler sabotage their shared research, delete Sarah's contributions from their digital presentations, and carefully position himself to look like the dedicated student while painting Sarah as the unreliable partner who was dragging down his grade. The psychological precision was nauseating in its familiarity. During their lab sessions, Tyler would make subtle comments designed to erode Sarah's confidence. "Are you sure about that calculation? You seem confused a lot lately." Or, "Maybe I should handle the important parts. You can just observe and take notes." Each comment was delivered with enough concern to seem helpful to casual observers, but Marcus could see the calculated cruelty beneath the surface, could recognize the systematic dismantling of another person's self-worth. Marcus found himself taking increasingly longer routes between classes, desperate to avoid witnessing Tyler's campaigns of destruction. But Jefferson High was too small for true escape, and every corner seemed to hold another tableau of familiar cruelty. He'd turn a corner and find Tyler accidentally knocking Sarah's books from her arms. He'd enter the bathroom and hear Tyler's voice echoing from the stalls, making jokes about Sarah's appearance that his followers repeated like gospel. He'd sit in the library trying to lose himself in homework and catch glimpses of Tyler photographing Sarah's personal notes, building an arsenal of ammunition for future humiliation. The worst part was how Tyler had weaponized Sarah's passion for art, the one thing that seemed to bring her genuine joy in an increasingly hostile world. Marcus discovered Tyler had been systematically destroying Sarah's work, not through obvious vandalism, but through subtle sabotage that looked accidental. Paint mixed with soap that would cause her canvases to bubble and peel days later. Brushes with bristles, loosened just enough to fall out during important projects. Portfolio pieces that developed mysterious tears right before submission deadlines. Marcus recognized the technique because he'd invented variations of it: the slow destruction of everything a victim held dear, the gradual erosion of their ability to find joy or success in anything. It was psychological waterboarding, a steady drip of cruelty designed to break someone's spirit without leaving obvious evidence of abuse. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Marcus stayed after school to make up a missed test. The building was nearly empty, just the hollow echo of his footsteps and the distant sound of janitors finishing their rounds. As he walked past the art room, he heard voices, Tyler's distinctive laugh and something else that made his blood freeze, the sound of someone crying. Through the partially open door, Marcus could see Sarah cornered against the supply cabinet, tears streaming down her face as Tyler held her latest painting, a self-portrait that had taken her weeks to complete. The artwork was beautiful, vulnerable, the kind of honest self-expression that made Marcus's chest ache with recognition of everything he'd destroyed in others. "You know what I think when I look at this?" Tyler's voice carried the casual malice that Marcus knew like his own reflection. "I think you've got some serious delusions about yourself. This painting shows someone confident, someone who matters. But look at you, you're nobody, you're nothing. Maybe your art should reflect reality." Tyler pulled out a black permanent marker, and Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis. He'd done this exact thing to a kid named Jeremy Walsh at Lincoln Academy, defaced the boy's science fair project right before judging, turning months of work into a monument to humiliation. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Jeremy standing in front of the judges with his project covered in obscene drawings, trying to explain through tears that it wasn't his work, that someone had sabotaged him. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking, "that painting, it's for my college portfolio. It's the only good piece I have left." Tyler's smile widened with the kind of sadistic pleasure that Marcus knew from the inside out. "College? You think any college wants someone like you? Let me help you understand what you really are." The marker moved toward the canvas, and Marcus felt something snap inside his chest like a rubber band pulled too tight. For a moment, just a moment, he was back in the cafeteria at Lincoln Academy, back in the parking lot with David Morrison's blood on his knuckles, back in the countless moments when he'd chosen cruelty over mercy and called it strength. But this time was different. This time he was watching from the outside, seeing his own monstrosity reflected in Tyler's actions. This time he understood what it felt like to be powerless, while someone else wielded the weapons he'd once mastered. The recognition was devastating and clarifying all at once. He wasn't just watching Tyler destroy Sarah. He was watching himself destroy every victim he'd ever created, seeing his own legacy play out in real time through someone else's hands. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, caught between two impossible choices: maintain his carefully constructed invisibility and let Sarah become another David Morrison, or risk everything by intervening and potentially unleashing the monster he'd worked so hard to cage. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding with the familiar rhythm of violence barely contained, and for the first time since arriving at Jefferson High, Marcus Chen understood that his past hadn't just followed him, it had arrived ahead of him, wearing Tyler Brooks's face and carrying out the exact same systematic destruction that had once been his signature. The marker hovered inches from Sarah's self-portrait, and Marcus realized that whatever choice he made in the next few seconds would define not just who he was, but who he could still become. The ghost who had learned to disappear, or the monster who had never really gone away. E foi naquele instante que tudo dentro dele mudou para sempre. The marker never touched the canvas. At the last second, Tyler pulled back with theatrical disappointment, savoring Sarah's terrified anticipation like fine wine. Actually, no. That would be too quick, too easy. I want you to destroy it yourself. His voice carried the patient cruelty of someone who understood that forcing victims to participate in their own destruction was the ultimate violation. Take it home tonight, and tomorrow you're going to bring it back torn in half. Tell everyone you realized how bad it was and decided to throw it away. Marcus felt his knees nearly buckle with the familiar nausea of recognition. He'd used this exact technique on a girl named Lisa Chen at Lincoln Academy, forced her to delete her own creative writing blog after weeks of systematic harassment. The psychological precision was surgical. Making victims complicit in their own annihilation was far more devastating than simple destruction. It left scars that went deeper than skin, wounds that festered in the soul long after bruises healed. "And if you don't?" Tyler continued, his smile never wavering. "Well, let's just say your locker combination isn't as private as you think it is. Neither is your home address. Amazing what people will share on social media without thinking about it." Sarah's face had gone ashen, her hands clutching the painting like a life preserver in a hurricane. Marcus watched her nod with the broken resignation of someone who understood that resistance would only make things worse, another expression he knew intimately from the mirror of memory. He'd seen that exact look on David Morrison's face in the weeks before the parking lot incident, the hollow-eyed acceptance of someone who'd learned that fighting back only amplified the suffering. Tyler gathered his things with theatrical satisfaction, pausing at the door to deliver one final knife twist. "Oh, and Sarah, clean yourself up before you leave. You look pathetic when you cry." He brushed past Marcus without acknowledgement, whistling a tune that echoed through the empty hallways, like the soundtrack to a nightmare. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, watching Sarah collapse against the supply cabinet as sobs racked her small frame. Her painting lay on the floor where she'd dropped it, the self-portrait staring up at the fluorescent lights with eyes that seemed to accuse him of cowardice. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to preserve his carefully constructed invisibility, but his feet remained planted on the threshold between action and abandonment. "Are you going to help her, or just stand there watching?" The voice belonged to Jamie Rodriguez, the school's head custodian, who'd appeared behind Marcus with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned to move through spaces without being noticed. His weathered face carried the kind of wisdom that came from years of cleaning up other people's messes, both literal and metaphorical. Marcus turned, startled by the question and the uncomfortable accuracy of its implications. Jamie's dark eyes held no judgment, only the patient recognition of someone who'd seen this particular drama play out countless times in countless variations. I was just..." Marcus's voice trailed off because there was no honest way to finish that sentence. "You were just what? Enjoying the show?" Jamie moved past him into the art room, his voice gentle but uncompromising. "Because from where I'm standing, silence looks a lot like approval." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, stirring up memories of every adult who'd turned away from his own campaigns of terror, every teacher who'd chosen to see normal teenage drama instead of systematic abuse. He thought of Dr. Hartwell's voice during their therapy sessions. "The opposite of love isn't hate, Marcus, it's indifference, and indifference is what allows real monsters to flourish." Jamie knelt beside Sarah with practiced gentleness, offering tissues from his custodial cart while speaking in quiet Spanish that Marcus didn't understand but recognized as comfort. Sarah looked up at him with grateful surprise, probably the first kindness she'd received from anyone at Jefferson High in weeks. The contrast between Jamie's simple humanity and Marcus's paralyzed cowardice was devastating in its clarity. "Mija," Jamie said softly, switching to English. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah's response was barely a whisper. "Since the first day. He won't stop. No matter what I do, he won't stop." The hopelessness in her voice was hauntingly familiar. Marcus had heard it from David Morrison in the weeks before everything went wrong, had dismissed it as weakness when it was actually the sound of someone drowning in plain sight. Jamie helped Sarah to her feet, his movements careful and respectful. "You need to tell someone in authority. Mrs. Chen in guidance or..." "No!" Sarah's response was sharp with panic. "He said if I tell anyone, he'll make it worse. He has friends everywhere and I'm nobody. Who's going to believe me?" She gathered her painting with shaking hands, treating it like fragile glass that might shatter at any moment. "I just have to survive until graduation. 2 more years. I can handle 2 more years." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest at those words. 2 more years of systematic torture, 2 more years watching Tyler perfect the same techniques that had made Marcus a legend of cruelty at Lincoln Academy. 2 more years of Sarah, slowly dissolving under the weight of relentless psychological warfare, while he stood by and did nothing, protected by his own carefully constructed invisibility. As Sarah gathered her things and fled the art room, Jamie turned to Marcus with eyes that seemed to see straight through his manufactured facade. "You know what that boy is doing to her, don't you?" "It wasn't really a question. You know because you recognize it." Marcus opened his mouth to deny it, to maintain his cover story, but the words wouldn't come. Jamie's expression wasn't accusatory. It was something far more dangerous. It was understanding. "I've been working in schools for 37 years, Jamie continued, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom. "I've seen kids like Tyler Brooks before, and I've seen kids like you too. The ones who know exactly what's happening because they've been on both sides of it." He paused, letting the implications settle like dust in still air. "The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Marcus fled the art room without answering, but Jamie's words followed him through the empty hallways, like shadows he couldn't outrun. The truth was a living thing in his chest now, growing stronger with each breath. He wasn't just watching Tyler destroy Sarah. He was actively enabling it through his silence, becoming complicit in the exact same kind of systematic cruelty that had defined his own dark legacy. That night, Marcus lay awake staring at his phone, Sarah's social media profiles glowing in the darkness. Tyler's campaign had followed her online, where digital cruelty could flourish 24 hours a day without adult supervision. Fake accounts had been created to comment on her photos with surgical precision. "Nobody asked for your opinion, and maybe try harder not to exist, and your art is as ugly as you are." Each comment had dozens of likes from Tyler's followers, turning her personal spaces into extensions of her school-based torment. Marcus scrolled through post after post, watching Sarah's online presence slowly shrink as the harassment intensified. Fewer photos, shorter captions, eventually just reposts of other people's content, because creating anything original had become too dangerous. It was digital murder by 1,000 cuts, the systematic erasure of someone's online identity through coordinated cruelty. The worst part was how familiar it all felt. Marcus had pioneered these exact techniques at Lincoln Academy, had turned social media into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. He'd created fake accounts to harass victims, had orchestrated campaigns of coordinated commenting, had used technology to extend his reach beyond school hours and into his victims' homes. The playbook Tyler was using was one Marcus had written in blood and tears 3 years ago. His phone buzzed with a notification. Tyler had posted a photo of Sarah's art supplies scattered across the hallway floor, captioned, "Some people just can't hold on to anything, can they?" The post already had 47 likes and counting. Each digital approval, another vote in favor of Sarah's systematic destruction. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to summon the ghost he'd worked so hard to become, the invisible boy who caused no trouble and drew no attention. But all he could see was David Morrison lying motionless on the asphalt. All he could hear was Sarah's whispered plea echoing through the art room. "Please." All he could feel was the weight of every choice he'd made to prioritize his own safety over someone else's survival. The next morning brought fresh horrors disguised as high school normalcy. Tyler had escalated his campaign with the patience of someone who understood that true psychological warfare was a marathon, not a sprint. Sarah arrived at school to find her locker combination had been changed, her books scattered across the hallway in what administrators would dismiss as a harmless prank. Her art portfolio had been accidentally soaked with coffee, months of work rendered worthless by calculated clumsiness that left no fingerprints of guilt. Marcus watched from across the hallway as Sarah knelt in the wreckage of her possessions, trying to salvage what remained of her academic life, while Tyler and his followers documented her humiliation with phone cameras. The familiar choreography of cruelty unfolded with mechanical precision, the victim's desperate attempts to preserve dignity, the predator's performance of innocent surprise, the bystander's careful blindness to obvious truth. But this time was different. This time, Marcus felt the weight of every student who walked past without stopping, every adult who chose not to see what was happening in plain sight. This time, he understood that his silence wasn't protecting him. It was destroying him from the inside out, turning him into the very thing he'd sworn never to become again, someone who enabled monsters to flourish. As Sarah gathered her ruined belongings with shaking hands, Marcus made a choice that terrified him more than any physical confrontation ever could. He walked toward her, each step feeling like crossing a minefield, knowing that the moment he broke his carefully constructed invisibility, there would be no going back to the safety of being nobody. Mas algo maior estava se preparando nas sombras, algo que nem ele nem Tyler poderiam ter previsto. End of Block 4. Marcus is finally beginning to break his silence and take action, setting up the climactic confrontation. Should I continue with Block 5, where the situation escalates to a life-threatening crisis that forces Marcus to fully confront his past and make the ultimate choice between safety and heroism? Marcus's first step towards Sarah felt like jumping off a cliff, but before he could reach her, Tyler's voice cut through the hallway noise like a blade through silk. Well, looks like our little artist made a mess. His tone carried that particular quality Marcus knew so well, the false sympathy that made cruelty sound like concern. Maybe you should be more careful with your things, Sarah. Some people might think you're doing this for attention. The crowd that had gathered wasn't just watching anymore. They were participating, phones raised like weapons, documenting Sarah's humiliation for eternal digital preservation. Marcus recognized the hunger in their faces, the way ordinary kids transformed into a mob when given permission to witness someone else's destruction. He'd cultivated that same bloodthirsty audience at Lincoln Academy, had turned his victims' suffering into entertainment for the masses. Sarah's hands were bleeding from trying to gather her broken portfolio, tiny cuts from the shattered plastic that mixed with tears she could no longer control. The sight of her blood on the hallway floor sent Marcus reeling back 3 years, back to David Morrison's face against the asphalt, back to the moment when he'd realized that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. "Hey!" Marcus's voice came out smaller than he'd intended, barely audible above the cruel laughter echoing off the lockers. Sarah looked up at him with the wariness of prey that had learned to expect only pain from human contact. "Let me help you." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt the shift in the crowd's attention like a physical weight. Tyler's smile faltered for just a moment, not from concern, but from the predator's instinctive recognition that something in the ecosystem had changed. Marcus knelt beside Sarah, his hands shaking as he helped gather her scattered belongings, hyper-aware of every phone camera trained on his face. "You don't have to," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with tears and something that might have been hope. "He'll just make it worse for both of us." Marcus met her eyes and saw his own reflection in her fear. Every victim he'd ever created, every person he'd systematically destroyed for the crime of existing in his presence. "Yeah," he said quietly, helping her salvage what remained of a watercolor painting. "I know." Tyler's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "How sweet. The new kid wants to play hero." He stepped closer, and Marcus felt his body tense with muscle memory that had nothing to do with courage. But heroes need to be careful, don't they? Sometimes trying to save people just gets everyone hurt. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Marcus recognized the technique because he'd perfected it. The implied violence, the suggestion that resistance would only amplify suffering. But something had shifted inside his chest, some fundamental recalibration that made Tyler's posturing look smaller, more desperate than threatening. "Maybe," Marcus said, rising to his feet with Sarah's rescued belongings in his arms. But sometimes doing nothing is worse than getting hurt. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Tyler. For a moment the hallway fell silent, except for the distant sound of closing lockers and shuffling feet. Then Tyler's smile returned, sharper and more dangerous than before. "We'll see about that." The next 3 days passed in a haze of escalating psychological warfare that felt like watching his own past unfold in fast forward. Tyler's retaliation was swift and surgical. Marcus's locker was vandalized with spray paint that spelled out "freak" in letters 3 inches tall. His class schedule was leaked online with annotations about his supposed mental instability. Rumors began circulating that he was on antipsychotic medication, that he'd been expelled from his previous school for violent behavior. The irony was devastating in its accuracy. Tyler was telling the truth about Marcus's past while meaning it as a lie, crafting a narrative of dangerous instability that was simultaneously false in its intent and horrifyingly accurate in its details. Marcus found himself defending against accusations that were actually confessions, denying a reputation that he'd earned through 3 years of systematic cruelty at Lincoln Academy. But the worst part was watching Sarah suffer the amplified consequences of his intervention. Tyler's rage at being challenged had focused into a laser beam of concentrated malice that made his previous torment look like gentle teasing. Sarah's phone number was posted on bathroom walls with offers of sexual services. Her social media accounts were hacked and filled with posts that made her appear mentally unstable. Anonymous tips were called in to school administration about her supposedly bringing weapons to school, resulting in humiliating public searches that found nothing but added another layer of institutional suspicion. Marcus watched it all unfold with growing horror, recognizing his own techniques being deployed with industrial efficiency. Tyler had learned from Marcus's legacy without knowing it, had absorbed the methodology of systematic destruction through some collective unconscious of cruelty that passed between generations of predators like a virus. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in November, when the first snow of the season turned the world white and made everything look clean, despite the rot underneath. Marcus was walking toward the parking lot when he heard shouting from the direction of the old maintenance building. Voices raised in excitement and fear that made his blood freeze with recognition. He ran toward the sound, his feet slipping on the wet pavement, and found a crowd gathered around the building's rear entrance. Through the gaps between bodies, Marcus could see Sarah pressed against the brick wall, her face pale with terror as Tyler held something that glinted silver in the gray afternoon light. "Just a little reminder," Tyler was saying, his voice carrying that familiar quality of false reasonableness that made threats sound like suggestions, "about knowing your place in the food chain." The knife was small, probably just a utility blade from the art room, but in Tyler's hands it had transformed into something far more dangerous. Marcus recognized the escalation pattern because he'd lived it from the other side. Words became threats, threats became physical intimidation became actual violence. Tyler had reached the point where psychological warfare was no longer sufficient, where the only way to maintain his dominance was through the implicit or explicit threat of physical harm. "Tyler, man, maybe we should," one of his followers started to say, but Tyler cut him off with a look that could have frozen blood. "Should what? Let her think she can embarrass me? Let the new freak think he can play hero without consequences." Tyler's grip on the blade tightened, and Marcus saw Sarah's eyes widen with the kind of terror that comes when you realize you're genuinely in danger. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. The crowd was shifting nervously now, the entertainment value of psychological torment evaporating in the face of potential actual violence. Some students were backing away, others were pulling out phones to record what they thought might be about to become a viral video of real assault. But no one was intervening, no one was calling for help, no one was willing to step between predator and prey when the stakes had escalated beyond social humiliation. Marcus felt time slow to crystalline clarity as Tyler raised the blade, not to stab, but to threaten, to demonstrate his absolute power over Sarah's physical safety. The gesture was theatrical, designed for maximum psychological impact, but Marcus knew how quickly theater could become reality. He'd stood in Tyler's exact position 3 years ago, holding power over David Morrison's safety, telling himself that he was just teaching a lesson right up until the moment when teaching became breaking. "Please," Sarah whispered, the word barely audible, but carrying enough desperation to cut through the afternoon air like a scream. "I won't tell anyone. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't." The sound of her begging was like hearing his own voice from the past, but reversed. Instead of the predator demanding submission, he was hearing the prey offer total surrender in exchange for basic safety. The role reversal was devastating in its clarity. This was what David Morrison had sounded like in those final moments before Marcus had chosen violence over mercy. This was what every victim sounded like when they realized that their humanity meant nothing to the person holding power over them. Marcus was moving before he consciously decided to move, his body acting on instincts that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with a recognition so fundamental it bypassed rational thought. He wasn't just watching Tyler threaten Sarah, he was watching himself threaten David Morrison, watching his own legacy of violence play out through someone else's hands. "Tyler," his voice carried across the space between them with shocking authority, the kind of command presence that he'd thought he'd buried forever, along with his reputation at Lincoln Academy. "Put it down." Tyler turned toward him with surprise that quickly transformed into something uglier. "The hero wants to play again. How sweet." But there was something different in his expression now. A flicker of uncertainty that suggested he was finally facing someone who understood the game he was playing from the inside out. Marcus stepped closer, his hands open and visible, his body language carefully calibrated to project calm authority instead of threat. 3 years of therapy had taught him the difference between intimidation and intervention, between dominance and leadership. "This isn't about being a hero," he said quietly. "This is about not becoming someone you can't live with." "I can live with anything," Tyler snarled, but his grip on the blade was shifting, uncertainty creeping into his performance of absolute control. "No," Marcus said, and his voice carried the weight of 3 years of therapy, of sleepless nights, of watching his family fall apart because of choices he'd made in moments just like this one. "You can't. Trust me on that." For a moment that felt like eternity. The world balanced on the edge of Tyler's decision. The crowd held its collective breath, phones still recording, waiting to see whether this would end in backing down or blood. Sarah pressed herself against the brick wall, tears streaming down her face as she watched 2 predators face off over her fate. And Marcus realized that everything, his family's exile, his sister's nightmares, his father's shame, his mother's broken heart, everything had led to this moment, this choice, this chance to finally answer the question that had haunted him for 3 years. When faced with the same circumstances that had created his legacy of violence, what would he choose to become? The blade glinted in Tyler's hand like a promise of pain, and Marcus took another step forward, knowing that whatever happened next would define not just who he was, but who he could still choose to be. E foi nesse momento que o passado e o presente colidiram com força suficiente para mudar tudo para sempre. The blade moved, not toward Sarah but toward Marcus, as Tyler's control finally snapped under the pressure of being challenged by someone who spoke his language of violence. "You want to be a hero so bad? Let me show you what happens to heroes." Marcus saw the attack coming with the crystal clarity of someone who'd orchestrated similar moments of explosive violence. Tyler's technique was sloppy, driven by rage rather than calculation. the kind of wild swing that Marcus would have dismissed as amateur hour during his reign at Lincoln Academy. But the blade was real, the intent was real, and in the split second before impact, Marcus made a choice that would shatter his carefully constructed invisibility forever. Instead of dodging, instead of deflecting, instead of using any of the violent skills that 3 years of systematic cruelty had burned into his muscle memory, Marcus stepped forward and wrapped Tyler in what could only be described as a bear hug. Not to hurt him, not to overpower him, but to contain him, to stop the violence through absorption rather than reflection. The blade caught Marcus across the ribs, a burning line of pain that made him gasp, but didn't stop him from holding on. Tyler struggled against his grip, confused by the lack of retaliation, expecting the escalation to violence that had always defined these moments in the past. But Marcus held firm, speaking in a voice that carried no threat, only the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I know what you're feeling right now," Marcus said, his words coming out tight with pain, but steady with conviction. "I know because I used to be you. The rage, the need to prove you're stronger, the way it feels like the only option is to hurt someone before they hurt you." Tyler's struggles were weakening, confusion replacing fury as Marcus continued to speak. "But I also know what comes after. I know what it feels like to wake up every morning for 3 years, wishing you could take back one moment, one choice, 1 second when everything went too far." The crowd had gone silent, phones still recording, but the atmosphere shifted from bloodthirsty entertainment to something approaching awe. Marcus could feel Tyler's body beginning to shake, not with rage anymore, but with something that might have been recognition. "Let me go," Tyler whispered. But the words carried no conviction, no real desire for freedom. They sounded more like a plea for someone to make the choice he couldn't make himself. "I will," Marcus said gently. "But first you need to drop the blade. Not because I'm making you, but because you're choosing to. Because the person you become in the next 10 seconds is the person you'll have to live with for the rest of your life." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Tyler's grip on the blade tightened, and Marcus felt the sharp edge press deeper into his side. Then, with a sound that was half sob and half scream, Tyler let it fall. The small utility knife clattered against the pavement with a sound like breaking chains, and Tyler collapsed against Marcus's chest as 3 years of accumulated rage finally found its way out through tears instead of violence. Marcus held him through it, this boy who was so much like the monster he used to be, understanding for the first time that predators weren't born fully formed. They were created through pain and choices and the terrible mathematics of hurt people hurting people. Tyler's sobs were harsh and ugly, the sound of someone finally confronting the weight of what they'd become, and Marcus felt his own eyes burning with tears he'd been holding back for 3 years. The crowd was dispersing now, the spell of potential violence broken by the unexpected turn towards something that looked disturbingly like healing. Some students were still filming, but others had put their phones away, perhaps recognizing that what they were witnessing was too real, too raw for casual consumption. Sarah remained pressed against the brick wall, watching with wide eyes as her tormentor fell apart in the arms of someone who understood his darkness. "I don't know how to stop," Tyler whispered against Marcus's shoulder, his voice broken and young, in a way that reminded Marcus that they were all just kids playing with weapons they didn't understand. "I don't know how to be anything else." "You learn," Marcus said simply. "One choice at a time. One moment when you choose to be better instead of bigger. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's possible." "I know, because I'm doing it too." Tyler pulled back to look at Marcus's face, searching for lies or manipulation, but finding only the kind of truth that comes from walking through fire and choosing to help others avoid the flames. "Who are you?" he asked, and Marcus understood that the question wasn't about names or histories. It was about recognition, about understanding how someone could speak the language of violence so fluently while choosing peace. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding them. Sarah with her paint-stained fingers and terrified eyes, the students with their phones and their hunger for drama, the grey November sky that made everything look like a photograph from someone else's life. Then he made a choice that terrified him more than any physical confrontation ever could. He told the truth. "My name is Marcus Morrison," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for the recording phones to capture. 3 years ago, at Lincoln Academy in Ohio, I put a kid named David Morrison in the hospital. I was the kind of person who turned other people's pain into my own entertainment. I was exactly like you, Tyler, except I went further than you did. I actually hurt someone badly enough that he'll carry the scars for the rest of his life. The silence that followed was different from the breathless anticipation of violence. This was the quiet of revelation, of truth too heavy for casual consumption. Marcus could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the crowd, phones being lowered as students realized they were witnessing something that transcended viral video material. "My family had to move across 3 states because of what I did," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "I lost everything. My home, my friends, my identity, my family's reputation. My little sister still has nightmares about the kids at her old school who blamed her for my choices. My father lost his job because nobody wanted to work with a monster's father. And every single day for 3 years, I've had to live with the knowledge that I destroyed someone's life because I was angry and thought violence was strength." Tyler was staring at him with a mixture of horror and fascination, seeing his own potential future reflected in Marcus's words. "But you stopped me. Why would you help me if you know what it's like to—" "Because I know what it's like to be you," Marcus said simply. "And I know what it's like to become someone you can't live with. And maybe, if I can stop one person from making the choices I made, then David Morrison's pain meant something. Maybe the last 3 years of hell my family went through can prevent someone else's family from going through the same thing." Sarah had moved closer during Marcus's confession, her earlier fear replaced by something that looked like understanding. She knelt beside them and picked up Tyler's fallen blade, holding it for a moment before dropping it into a nearby trash can. The gesture was simple but profound, the victim choosing to dispose of the weapon rather than claim it, choosing healing over revenge. "I don't forgive you," she said to Tyler, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her face. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I understand that you're sick, not evil. And maybe understanding is a place to start." Tyler nodded, unable to speak, still crying with the rawness of someone experiencing genuine remorse for the first time. Marcus helped him to his feet, both of them moving carefully around the wound in Marcus's side that was bleeding through his shirt but wasn't life-threatening. "What happens now?" Tyler asked. And Marcus heard the genuine terror in his voice, not fear of physical consequences, but fear of having to rebuild an identity based on something other than intimidation and control. "Now you do the work," Marcus said. "You apologize to everyone you've hurt and you mean it. You get help, real help, from people who understand how to rebuild someone from the inside out. You make different choices one day at a time until those choices become habits, and those habits become who you are." He paused, looking at the faces around them, at the phones that had captured his confession, at the grey sky that was starting to snow again. "And you accept that redemption isn't something you earn once, it's something you choose every single day for the rest of your life." The crowd was fully dispersing now, students heading toward their cars or the bus loop, carrying with them a story that would spread through Jefferson High like wildfire, but with an entirely different message than anyone had expected. Not a story of violence triumphant, but a story of violence transformed, of predators choosing to become protectors, of the possibility that even the darkest parts of human nature could be redirected toward healing. As the parking lot emptied, leaving just Marcus, Tyler, and Sarah standing in the gentle snowfall, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not the absence of guilt, but the presence of purpose. His confession would mean consequences. There was no hiding his identity now, no maintaining the carefully constructed fiction of the quiet transfer student. But for the first time since David Morrison's blood had stained his knuckles, Marcus understood that running from his past had been the wrong choice. The only way forward was through acceptance, through using his darkness to prevent others from falling into the same pit. "Will you help me?" Tyler asked, his voice small and lost. "I don't know how to be different. I don't know how to stop being angry all the time." Marcus looked at this boy who was so much like his former self, this predator who had chosen tears over violence when given the option, and felt something like hope unfurl in his chest. "Yeah," he said, "I'll help you. We'll figure it out together." Sarah was gathering her scattered belongings again, but this time she wasn't alone. Both Marcus and Tyler knelt to help her, the three of them working in careful silence to salvage what could be saved from the wreckage of the afternoon. Her self-portrait was damaged but not destroyed, paint smeared but the underlying structure still intact. Like all of them, Marcus thought. Scarred but not broken, capable of being rebuilt into something stronger than what came before. 3 weeks later, Marcus Morrison stood in front of Jefferson High's administration, his parents flanking him like bookends of quiet strength as he formally enrolled under his real name for the first time in 3 years. The paperwork was extensive. His history at Lincoln Academy had to be disclosed, his juvenile record examined, his psychological evaluations reviewed. But Principal Williams, a woman who'd spent 30 years believing in second chances, had seen the video of Marcus's confession that had gone viral throughout the school district. "Redemption isn't a destination, Mr. Morrison," she'd said during their meeting. "It's a daily practice. Are you prepared to practice it here, in front of everyone who knows exactly who you used to be?" Marcus had looked out her office window at the students walking between buildings, at Tyler Brooks sitting alone at a picnic table, reading a book on anger management, at Sarah Chen painting a new self-portrait that included scars along with strength. "Yes, ma'am," he'd said, "I think I'm finally ready to stop running from who I was and start becoming who I want to be." The road ahead wasn't easy. It never was, for people trying to rebuild themselves from ashes. Tyler's journey through therapy was brutal and necessary, his path toward redemption measured in small victories and frequent setbacks. Sarah's healing was equally complex, her trust rebuilding slowly through consistent actions rather than grand gestures. And Marcus's own transformation continued daily, each choice to help rather than harm, to protect rather than dominate, adding another brick to the foundation of the person he was becoming. But they were walking that road together, 3 kids who'd learned that the most powerful weapon against cruelty wasn't more cruelty. It was the radical act of choosing compassion when vengeance would be easier. They'd learned that monsters weren't born, they were made, which meant they could also be unmade, choice by careful choice, day by patient day. Marcus Morrison, no longer hiding behind a false name, no longer pretending to be someone he wasn't, had finally understood that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about using that past to build a future where other people's pain mattered more than his own power, where strength was measured not by who you could break, but by who you could help heal. And every morning when he looked in the mirror, instead of seeing the ghost of someone who'd caused irreparable harm, he saw the face of someone who was learning, slowly but surely, how to transform personal darkness into collective light. The scars remained, they always would. But scars, he'd learned, weren't signs of weakness. They were proof that something had been broken and chosen to heal stronger than before. The most powerful victories aren't won through violence. They're won through the courage to choose compassion when cruelty would be easier. Every day, we face moments where we can either build others up or tear them down. The choice we make defines not just who we are, but who we have the power to become. If this story resonated with you, If you've ever stood at the crossroads between revenge and redemption, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed transformation in your own life? Have you seen someone choose healing over harm? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you believe in the power of second chances and the possibility that people can change, subscribe for more stories that prove redemption is always possible, one choice at a time.